But today, we are back to Hebrews chapter 11, okay? We're well over halfway now, so just probably 2 or 3 more sessions to go. And what we're going to be looking at today are 4 snapshots from the life of Moses that illustrate how our faith helps us to determine what choices to make in life and the consequence of making wise choices based on our faith. Now, I don't know if you have favourite characters in Scripture, but I think for me, probably Moses would be one of them up there, on the list, because there are so many instances in the life of Moses that we could point to and talk about his faith. But the writer to Hebrews just picks out 4 of them, and actually one of them isn't actually specifically about Moses. We'll come to that in a moment. But we discovered way back at the beginning of this chapter that there is a deep connectivity between faith and hope. Because the writer, in giving us a broad overview of biblical faith, tells us that faith gives us the assurance of things that we hope for. So faith begins with hope. And hope is birthed in the promises of God. So there's a process involved that results in faith. And we see in Scripture the promise of God, and that begins to give birth to a hope in our hearts. But that hope in our hearts needs to somehow become a living reality rather than just remain some kind of far-off, unobtainable dream. And so God, in his wisdom and in his kindness, brings circumstances into our lives that bring us to a place where we have to make choices. So are we going to pursue a course of action that means that we have to trust God for the outcome? Does our hope in God provide a new kind of behavior? Faith will always lead us into action. Unbelief, on the other hand, is very passive and it's inactive, and it actually leads to laziness. Now, Daniel 11:32 tells us that the people who know their God will stand firm and they'll take action. And so there are times in each one of our lives when God confronts us with a choice. Will we stand firm and let our faith lead us into action? Or will we back down and settle for a more comfortable life? And every time that we make a choice, we have to determine 2 consequential outcomes. What is the short-term consequence of my choice? And what is the long-term consequence of my choice? And one of the things that faith brings us face to face with is the true nature of our lives. Because we tend to view our lives, don't we, primarily in terms of the 60, 70, maybe 80 years of our existence here on the earth. But, of course, the Bible makes it very clear that we are, in fact, eternal beings. And our life on this planet is not all that there is. Life continues beyond the grave. And so, because of that, we need to have a radical change in our perspective. We need a paradigm that helps us to lift our gaze beyond the here and now and see the fullness of our lives from an eternal perspective. And there is a consequence to that. That means that the choices that we make now, the way that we live by faith now, will determine to a large extent what our lives will look like and what our lives will be doing in 1,000 years' time, 1,000,000 years' time, 1,000,000,000 years' time, and on into that timeless expanse of eternity. The choices that we make in this life, they really do make a difference. And the choices that we make today to obey God by faith may result in short-term suffering, but they also secure our eternal blessing. So there's a short-term consequence and there's a long-term consequence. So this morning, we're going to look at a series of choices that demonstrate faith in action, that not only had consequences for Moses himself, but also impacted on the lives of a whole nation, and ultimately shaped the course of world history. So, with that in mind, let's look at our verses for today. So this is Hebrews 11, verses 23 to 28. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. Now, we could probably spend a whole session on each of those 4, but I'm going to spare you that, and we're going to look at all 4 of those together this morning. So here we have 4 crisis points in the life of Moses. And what we're going to see this morning is how faith was the determining factor that determined the chosen course of action in each case, and how that might influence our own faith-based decision-making. So the first one, Moses' parents were not afraid. Now, to be entirely accurate, as I said just now, the first example was not actually the faith of Moses himself. He was a bit too young to be exercising faith at that time. But it was that of his parents. And the writer of Hebrews doesn't actually name his parents. They remain anonymous. Now, I wonder if you know their names. Well, they are there in the Bible, but you won't find it in the book of Exodus. You have to go to the book of Numbers to find them. Numbers 26, verses 58 and 59. And Moses' father was called Amram, and his mother was Jochebed. And I'm sure we all know the story of what Moses' parents did with the baby Moses, because the circumstances of Moses' survival after his birth are remarkable. You could even say that they were miraculous. Now, very briefly, the context tells us that the Israelites in Egypt had grown numerically to such an extent that the Pharaoh, who obviously was much later, this is several hundred years later after Joseph, so didn't really know of how Joseph and the people that came from Joseph actually helped Egypt. This Pharaoh felt threatened by their numbers, and so had issued an edict ordering that all male children born to Hebrew parents must be thrown into the River Nile. The first thing that we have to notice from our text today is that Moses' parents were Hebrews, and therefore they were among the slaves of Egypt. But they had been brought up in the knowledge of God's covenantal promises to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and they were clearly worshippers of the living God. So, when Moses was born, they were immediately thrust into a position where they had to make a choice. You see, the edict of Pharaoh actually contained two threats. One was explicit and the other implicit. The first was the threat to the life of the newborn child. And the second was the threat that if you obey this command and keep a Hebrew baby boy alive, you will be disobedient to the Pharaoh's law and your own life would be at risk. So that was the dilemma facing Amram and Jochebed. They had two choices: to kill their child or allow their child to be thrown into the Nile and save themselves, or they could try to save their son and risk their own lives. That's the context of Hebrews 11:23 when it says that they were not afraid of the king's edict. Now, the thing with a newborn child is that you can only keep them concealed for a short time. And after about 3 months, it became very clear that concealment was no longer an option and something more had to be done. Now, in the course of those 3 months, it says in Hebrews 11:23, and that's actually echoing Exodus 2 verse 2, that his mother saw that Moses was a beautiful child. Now, of course, you ask any mother and they will tell you that their child is beautiful. So why does the Bible make a point of saying this? I think it's not so much that Jochebed saw the natural human beauty of a newborn baby, because every mother would see that. But she saw, I think, a prophetic destiny in her son as she prayed over him. You see, I think God gave her an insight into what Moses was to become. And she saw the beauty of a life given to serving the living God and the people of Israel. And so she came up with a plan. Notice in so many of our examples in this chapter, it's the women that came up with the plan, one way or the other. And I'm sure the Holy Spirit was instrumental in giving her that plan. And this plan gave Moses a fighting chance of survival. Well, we all know what happened, don't we? She made this basket of bulrushes, made it waterproof, and she floated it among the reeds in the shallows of the Nile, at the place where she knew that Pharaoh's daughter would come and bathe. And sure enough, Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe, and as she did so, she spotted this thing floating in the rushes. She spotted the basket, and so she called her maid over, and her maid waded in and fished out the basket from the river. And of course, on opening the basket, Pharaoh's daughter beheld this beautiful baby boy, and her heart was filled with compassion. She knew exactly what this was. It was a Hebrew child. But she couldn't bring herself to seeing this beautiful child thrown into the river to drown. Now, Moses' elder sister, Miriam, was watching to see what would happen. And with a great deal of boldness, she approached Pharaoh's daughter and she planted a seed. Shall I go and fetch a Hebrew nursemaid for him? And so off she went, and she brought Moses' own mother to Pharaoh's daughter. And she was given Moses to look after on Pharaoh's daughter's behalf. And not only that, but she was given wages to do so. And so Jochebed was able to bring up her child until it was time for him to become Pharaoh's daughter's adopted son. Well, that's the very bare bones of the story. But what's the point that the writer of Hebrews is making, and how does it relate to our journey in faith? In verse 23, the writer makes the point that by faith they hid their son because they were not afraid of the king's edict. Now remember, I said that there were two threats in Pharaoh's edict. One was against baby boys, and one was against those who don't kill baby boys. So if you kill the baby, you save your life. But if you don't kill your baby, you risk your own life. So the decision not to drown their newborn boy meant that they were risking their own lives. So in very real terms, they were looking the fear of maybe torture and even death in the face and saying, we're not going to give in to you. We will not kill our son out of fear for our own lives. Fear of death will not control us. When faced with circumstances that threaten our very lives, faith frees us for this kind of radical courage and risk-taking, because it's the assurance that what God promises to those who die in the pursuit of love is better than what the world promises to those who shun the risk and save themselves. Faith in God's promises quite simply frees us from the fear of death, and it gives us confidence to pursue the risks of love. Now, most of us in our everyday lives don't face this particular threat, but I think times are going to change, and times will change. And we may increasingly, in days to come, find ourselves in situations where we may have to make this kind of radical decision. I'll just sow that little seed in your spirit today and just pray about it and see what God says. But you see, this also opens up a secondary can of worms. You see, if we want to live our lives on the cutting edge, where we encounter risks and dangers in order to meet great crises and great needs, there is actually a point of realism and balance that's illustrated here. Moses' parents didn't kill their baby, but they did hide their baby. You could argue that if Moses' parents had had real faith, they would have entrusted the child's care to God, and they would have just walked around in the community with their new baby. That would have been real faith. But you see, there's a thin line between faith and arrogance. And I think we just have to heed Jesus' words in Matthew 10:16, where he says that we must be wise as serpents, but innocent as doves. In other words, we must use spiritual integrity and not presume upon God. And so we seek for godly wisdom in all circumstances. So just as a little example, in these days when the threat of COVID is part of our everyday experience, we take all sensible and necessary precautions to protect ourselves and others. In other words, we don't ignore the precautions and expect God to keep us safe and protect us while we take risks and expose ourselves to infection. To do otherwise would be presumption at best and arrogance at worst. Just because God can do something miraculous in response to our actions doesn't mean that he will. Jesus illustrated this when Satan took him to the pinnacle of the temple. Do you remember this? In the temptation in the wilderness, Satan took Jesus to the pinnacle of the temple, and he suggested that Jesus should jump off to see if God would catch him. Well, Jesus sternly rebuked him and said we shouldn't put God to the test in that sort of way, even in the pretext of acting by faith. Faith comes from an assurance, not from a misplaced presumption. So now let's move on and look at the next example of faith in the life of Moses. Verses 24 to 26. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. So in these verses, we find Moses making a radically dangerous and costly choice that was to shape the rest of his future. Now, the last time we saw Moses, he'd just been given back to his birth mother to be nursed and weaned. We don't know how long he was with his mother, but it would certainly have been probably for at least 3 years and probably longer. And during that time, he would have received the full training of a Jewish home. He would be instilled and ingrained with the messianic hope. He was there long enough so that they could have taught him messianic truth. Long enough so that he would have had the great covenantal promise of Abraham that had been reiterated to Isaac and to Jacob and Joseph instilled in him, so that he knew that what God had planned for his people, because it's apparent later on that Moses did know all these things. So however long he stayed, however many years Jochebed was able to raise her own son, it was long enough to instill him with the great truths that were Israel's promises from God, that they would not only leave Egypt, but that God had promised them a great deliverer someday. He knew well the great Abrahamic promise, the covenant of a great nation, a great seed, and through them that the world would be blessed, and that the land would belong to them. All of this undoubtedly was drilled into little Moses. But when he returned to Pharaoh's daughter and he joined the royal court, what happened? Well, being the son of Pharaoh's daughter meant that he was a prince of Egypt and in a very privileged position. And he grew up enjoying state-of-the-art Egyptian technology and luxury. He was educated in all of the learning of the Egyptians, and that would have included the Egyptians' fascination with magic. And that meant he would have been exposed to the ways and the ideologies of the Egyptians. In fact, at that time, Pharaoh himself had no sons. And so Moses potentially was actually in line to become the next Pharaoh, heir to the throne of the whole kingdom of Egypt. But you know, there was an even greater pull on the heart of Moses than the riches and the comfort and the privilege of the Egyptian court. And we don't know the details or the circumstances of this decision. All we know from the scriptures is that Moses made a choice. And what caused him to turn his back on his Egyptian heritage and instead identify with his own Hebrew nation? According to the writer to Hebrews, it was faith. Faith led him to make that momentous decision. The writer expresses the dangerous, painful path that Moses had chosen in 2 ways. First, in verse 25, it's the choosing of ill treatment with the people of God over the passing pleasures of sin. And then secondly, in verse 26, it's the choosing of reproach for Christ or the Messiah over the treasures of Egypt. Now note this. The choice was made before the threat of Pharaoh. The bridges had already been burned between Moses and Egypt. It had happened in his heart. Maybe not yet geographically, but spiritually and morally, he was already gone. And yet again, as we've seen so many times in these examples of faith recorded in this chapter, there's one overarching reason for the outworking of Moses' faith in this way. At the end of verse 26, it says that Moses was looking to the reward. He knew for certain that there was something better that lay up ahead and was straining at the leash to obtain it. And so for Moses, in one sense, the choice was a no-brainer. He chose ill treatment with God's people, and he chose reproach for the Messiah because he knew that God was as good as his word. And so he staked everything on the hope yet to come. He gave it all up and counted it all as rubbish for the sake of the reward and the destiny that God had wounded his heart with. Faith can be that powerful. It's the driving force that compels us and enables us to make the hardest of decisions, giving us conviction and courage to face the unknown, secure in the knowledge that there is a crown of life laid up for us, and that God is the rewarder of those who put their trust in him. So what happened next? Well, let's look at the next verse. Moses was not afraid. Verse 27. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the danger of the king, the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. So we learn from Exodus 2 that from this point on, Moses began to identify himself with his kinsmen, the Hebrew slaves. He grew more and more indignant with their slavery. You may remember that he came across an Egyptian beating one of the Hebrew slaves and intervened and ultimately killed the Egyptian, burying him in the sand. Now he thought that he'd managed to conceal what he'd done, but the next day he discovered that what he'd done was actually common knowledge, at least among the Hebrews. And eventually the news of what Moses had done reached Pharaoh, and his response was to threaten Moses' life. So it was at this point that Moses took the pragmatic decision to remove himself from Israel. And the Bible says that he went and he settled in the land of Midian.
He removed himself from Egypt, not Israel.
Sorry, from Egypt. Yes. He removed himself from Egypt. Now, we're not talking here about a short journey. It's not just a couple of stops on a number 9 bus. You know, this was a journey of some 300 miles or so across the wilderness of what is today the Sinai Peninsula. And he ended up on the other side of the Red Sea in Saudi Arabia. That's where the land of Midian is. So Moses was making sure that there was a good distance between him and Egypt. And it's here that we have a bit of a dilemma. Because if you read the account of this episode in Moses' life in Exodus chapter 2, it says that Moses fled from Pharaoh, which kind of implies that there was an element of fear involved. And yet the writer of Hebrews categorically states that Moses did not fear the anger of Pharaoh. So what's going on? Well, it says, by faith, he left Egypt. That means that he knew what he was doing. And he understood that from here on in, his life was going to be very different. And he didn't just leave Egypt and give it up as a bad job. The word used here, when it says that he went from Egypt, it literally means he abandoned it. It's not just a physical moving away. It actually means it's a heart renunciation. He abandoned it as a system and as a way of life. So no, it wasn't fear that led him away, but it was a rejection of the whole system in his heart. He tasted the best that the world had to offer, and he'd found it wanting. In his mind, he wanted nothing to do with Egypt again, ever. But of course we know that God had other plans. And the real key to Moses leaving Egypt in faith and not in fear is found in the second half of the verse, where it says that he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Now that sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? How can you see someone who's invisible? But remember how the writer explains faith in verse 1, where he says that faith is the conviction of things, what? Not seen. There's the clue. By faith, Moses endured because he saw by faith that which cannot be seen by physical sight. And Paul actually sums this up in 2 Corinthians 5 verse 7. He says, "For we walk by faith, not by sight." So the motivating force that ultimately drove Moses out of Egypt was faith, not fear. He didn't leave out of fearful, self-serving unbelief. Instead, it was a persevering, an enduring in spite of the threats of Pharaoh, in the obedience of faith. He was remembering what he'd learnt from his mother. He remembered the promises that God had made to Abraham, and he feared the unseen God of Abraham. He feared this God more than he feared the Pharaoh of Egypt. He looked to this unseen God to work out his purposes for his people. So the bridges were burned between Moses and Egypt well before he was threatened by Pharaoh. They were burned in his heart, and they were burned by faith. That's what this chapter is all about. Time after time, the writer is describing faith that's a hunger for God that triumphs over hunger for the pleasures of this world, releasing radical, God-centered, risk-taking new behavior. Faith takes us on a journey where we don't always know what we're going to encounter on the way. And whilst we always have the ultimate destination in mind, the New Jerusalem, the eternal city that will one day be our dwelling place, which we see with the eye of faith, and yet there is still a journey that has to be undertaken, which also requires faith. And here, Moses gives us a key. The endurance that's needed for that journey of faith comes by seeing him who is invisible. He comes by revelation to those who honestly seek him, who have exchanged the inferior pleasures of this world for the superior pleasures of knowing him, pursuing him, burning bridges for the sake of the upward call of God in Christ. Well, we've got one more verse to look at, which is verse 28, which says that by faith Moses kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. So 40 years have now passed, and God has brought Moses back to the land of Egypt, not as a royal prince, but as the deliverer of Israel. Now, God has been at work in the life of Moses during this time, and he's not the same man who left 40 years previously. Moses has had many encounters with God and many conversations with God. He has been prepared in his heart and in his spirit, and now it's time for him to come back to Egypt and put God's plan into action. Now, by this time, the old Pharaoh had died, and there was a new Pharaoh ruling in Egypt. God had assured Moses that his life was no longer in danger, so that it was safe to him to come back, to return. And the first thing he had to do when he got there was to convince the Israelites that he'd been sent by God, which he did by backing up his words with miraculous signs that God had shown him to do. You know what the Israelites are like for a sign? You know, Jesus says that this people, you know, they long to see a sign. Well, we're quite familiar with what happened next, aren't we? Where Moses releases the plagues or the signs on Pharaoh and the people of Egypt. And every time Pharaoh hardened his heart and would not let the people go. Now, the interesting thing about the first 9 signs was that they did not affect the Israelites. They were living in a separate place called Goshen. And every time Moses released one of the signs, the Israelites in Goshen were protected and they were not affected. But the 10th sign was different. God said he was going to come through the whole land and the firstborn of all animals and people were going to die. But Moses explains to the people of Israel that there is nothing to be afraid of, because there is going to be a way of escaping this judgment. But it's very specific, and it must be carried out exactly as God says. And so they all prepared their Passover lambs. They brought them into their houses and lived with them for a few days. And we know that God was faithful to protect and spare all those who had marked their doorposts with the blood of the lamb. Now, although the writer of Hebrews singles out Moses as having kept the Passover, he's really commending the people of Israel. And in fact, that's what he goes on to do with his next examples. For Moses himself, his reputation, his credibility to be the deliverer of Israel was on the line. He himself had to first of all demonstrate his faith in God by passing on to the people all that God had shown him. And that included encouraging the people to act in their own faith and to trust in God. And what this highlights for us is that personal faith is necessary. You cannot live on the faith of others. You can be influenced by it, but you can't live by it. Each person had to apply their own faith. They couldn't rely on the faith of Moses. So each Israelite had to comply with the instructions and put them into practice. It was not enough just for Moses to do it. They all had to. They all had to make it personal. And the point he is making is not so much the logistics and the significance of the Passover, important as that is, but the faith of those who kept it. He's highlighting the strong connection between faith and obedience, because in this case, any deviation from God's command would have resulted in death. And I think the big lesson that this example of faith teaches us is that when God tells us to do something, especially something that has a dimension of faith to it, we need to ascertain and be quite sure exactly what it is that God is wanting us to do. And as with the Passover, I'm sure that there were those who didn't understand the significance behind what they were being required to do. We know, because we live on this side of the cross, the foreshadowing of the sacrificial, the sacrifice of the true Passover that was being demonstrated in this Passover. You see, most of the Israelites probably couldn't have explained the theology behind what they were being asked to do. All they were concerned with was, is this going to work? By faith, they brought the lamb into their houses and then followed the instructions to slaughter the lamb and paint its blood on the doorposts. It was faith that compelled them to do it. And it was in response to that same faith that the angel of death passed over their houses, leaving the firstborn untouched. Well, let's wrap this up. Time's pressing on. Sometimes, our faith causes us to touch on the deep things of God. Faith is not a cheap commodity. Often it's very costly. And certainly for Moses in these examples, we see how choices that he made because of faith impacted upon his life in a very significant way. I think by now we're beginning to get the message that although faith, according to this chapter, is like a many-faceted diamond, one way or another, it's the one single component of our life that God uses to lead us into action. And often, it's not a single one-off action, but a whole new kind of behaviour. Now, we've still got maybe 2 or 3 more sessions to go before we leave chapter 11, and I hope we're not suffering from faith overload. I think what I find fascinating is, is the way that faith can be demonstrated in so many different ways. And it causes us to keep looking back at verse 1 and ponder on what are the things that we hope for? What are the things that are unseen? And as we do so, we begin to reconnect with our God-given sense of awe and wonder as God begins to reveal some of the hidden depths to be found in him. There's a river that flows from the throne of God. Let's get into that river and have our hearts made glad by all that he wants to impart to us and receive it by faith. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High.